Glass clinked against marble as my father leaned closer to Rhea across the cafe table. His voice carried that familiar edge of contempt I'd spent 28 years learning to recognize. "He tinkers with broken watches in a closet-sized shop," he said, each word deliberate as a knife cut. "That's not ambition. That's avoidance of real life." Rhea's fingers tightened around her coffee cup, but she didn't interrupt. My father continued, straightening his expensive tie. "I'm telling you this as someone who understands financial reality. Nilesh is charming, sure. Gentle, even. But charm doesn't pay mortgages. Gentleness doesn't build security." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "You're an intelligent woman with real prospects. Why would you chain yourself to someone who's already peaked at mediocrity?" The rain outside traced patterns down the window behind them, blurring the streetlights into watercolor streaks. Rhea finally spoke, her voice quieter than he probably expected. "Is that everything you wanted to say?" My father nodded, leaning back with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd just performed a public service. Rhea reached into her bag. What she pulled out would change everything, but in that moment, my father had no idea what was coming. "My name is Nilesh Kumar, and I spent most of my life believing I was exactly what my father said I was. Forgettable. Small. A disappointment wrapped in good intentions. I lived above a narrow shop on Kalaba Street, surrounded by the steady tick-tick-tick of broken timepieces waiting for repair. The building was old, the kind where paint peeled in long strips and the stairs groaned under your weight. My grandfather had opened this shop 60 years ago, back when craftsmanship still meant something to people. He'd taught me everything before he died, his weathered hands guiding mine as we dismantled pocket watches and restored their hidden mechanisms. Those were good years, before my father decided I'd wasted my education on manual labor. The shop barely made enough to cover rent and food, but it was mine. Every morning, I'd unlock the metal shutter, brew terrible coffee on a camping stove, and lose myself in the delicate work of making broken things whole again. Outside, the city rushed past in its endless hurry. Inside, time moved differently, measured in careful adjustments and patient attention. I didn't know then that Rhea was already planning something extraordinary, or that my father's cruelty would become the catalyst for everything that followed. My father, Vikram Kumar, measured human worth the way bankers measure interest rates. Everything reduced to numbers, projections, returns on investment. He'd spent 40 years in commercial banking before retiring to a life of golf, investment portfolios, and unsolicited opinions about other people's failures. To him, success meant corner offices, imported sedans, and the kind of respect that came from having money. My grandfather's watchmaking legacy meant nothing to him. Archaic, he called it. A dying art for dying men. When I chose to continue the shop instead of accepting his arranged position at a financial firm, something between us broke permanently. He stopped visiting. Stopped calling, except to deliver cutting remarks disguised as concern. At family gatherings, he'd introduce me with apologetic tones. "My son works with his hands," he'd say, as if I repaired sewers instead of intricate mechanical art. My mother tried to bridge the gap, but she'd learned long ago that challenging Vikram Kumar meant enduring his silent treatment for months. So she stayed neutral, loving us both from a safe distance. I convinced myself I didn't need his approval anymore. I had my work, my quiet life, my grandfather's tools. But deep down, some part of me still hoped he'd walk into the shop one day and finally see what I saw in the work. Rhea Deshmukh entered my shop on a Thursday afternoon in late April, carrying a broken locket and an energy that immediately disrupted the room's careful stillness. She wore a simple green kurta, her hair pulled back in a practical bun, but something about her presence made the cramped space feel suddenly inadequate. "Can you fix this?" she asked, placing the silver locket on my workbench. The chain was tangled, the clasp broken, and the hinge that held the two halves together had seized completely. "My grandmother's," she explained. "I know it's not valuable, but it matters to me." I examined it under my magnifying lamp, noting the delicate engraving work, the way someone had once cared enough to make this thing beautiful. "I can fix it," I told her. "Come back Tuesday." She didn't leave. Instead, she wandered the shop, examining the watches in various states of repair, asking questions about mechanisms and materials. She understood more than most customers, catching technical terms I used and asking follow-ups that showed genuine curiosity. We talked for nearly an hour before she finally left, and when the door closed behind her, the shop felt emptier than before. Tuesday came, and she returned for the locket, delighted with the repair. Then she asked if I could look at a watch her father had left behind. Then a broken music box. Soon, her visits became regular, expected, the best part of my week. Every Sunday, Rhea appeared at my shop entrance just as I was opening, carrying 2 cups of chai from the corner vendor and a smile that made my chest ache. We'd sit on the worn wooden stools by the workbench, talking while I demonstrated repairs or showed her my grandfather's old design sketches. She asked about everything. How did I source parts? What made one mechanism superior to another? Had I ever considered designing my own pieces instead of just repairing others? That last question caught me off guard. Design. I laughed, uncomfortable. That's not really my world. Why not? She pressed. You understand these mechanisms better than anyone. You see the beauty in how they work. Why couldn't you create something new? I didn't have a good answer, so I deflected, showing her a particularly complicated pocket watch mechanism instead. But the question lingered after she left. That night, I pulled out my grandfather's final, unfinished design, something I hadn't looked at in years. It was ambitious, combining traditional craftsmanship with a unique complication he'd invented, a way of displaying moon phases that no one had attempted before. He'd died before completing it, and I'd kept the sketches locked away, too intimidated to try finishing what he'd started. Looking at them now, with Rhea's voice still echoing in my mind, I felt something stir. Not confidence, exactly. But possibility. 3 months into our Sunday meetings, something shifted between us. We'd been discussing the potential market for custom mechanical watches when Rhea suddenly went quiet, studying me with an intensity that made me nervous. What? I asked, self-conscious. She set down her chai. Do you ever think about us? The question hung in the air between the ticking clocks. My throat went dry. I'd thought about little else for weeks but had convinced myself I was misreading our friendship, seeing romance where she only saw interesting conversation. I think about you constantly, I admitted quietly. But I didn't think someone like you would ever see someone like me that way. She stood, moving around the workbench until she was close enough that I could smell the jasmine in her hair. Someone like me. Smart. Accomplished. Going places. I gestured at the cramped shop. This is where I am. This is probably where I'll always be. Rhea took my face in her hands, her palms warm against my cheeks. Nilesh Kumar, she said firmly, you have no idea what you're capable of. Then she kissed me, and the world reduced to that single point of contact, everything else falling away. When we finally broke apart, I was shaking. She smiled, that brilliant, knowing smile. Now, she said, let's talk about what we're going to build together. I introduced Rhea to my father 3 weeks later at his house in Worli, a gleaming apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Arabian Sea. My mother had insisted on arranging dinner, hopeful that meeting someone I cared about might soften my father's perpetual disappointment. It didn't. Vikram Kumar greeted Rhea with practiced politeness, the kind reserved for business acquaintances he'd never see again. He asked surface-level questions about her background, her education, her family. When she mentioned working in supply chain consulting, his interest flickered briefly, but died when he learned she was considering leaving corporate life to pursue independent projects. Independent projects, he repeated, the phrase clearly distasteful. That's often code for unemployment. Rhea handled it gracefully, deflecting with humor. But I saw my father's assessment happening in real time, the way he'd already categorized and dismissed us both as financially unserious people playing at adulthood. After dinner, while my mother showed Rhea family photographs, my father cornered me in the kitchen. "She seems intelligent," he said, loading the words with unspoken criticism. "I hope she knows what she's signing up for, tying herself to your situation." "My situation is fine," I said quietly. He made a dismissive sound. "You're 30 years old, Nilesh. Living above a failing shop, no real assets, no growth trajectory. I'm just saying, she deserves to understand the reality before making any permanent decisions." What I didn't know then was that my father had cornered Rhea on her way out, asked if he could walk her to her car. Under the building's elegant portico, he delivered his assessment with brutal efficiency. "You're making a mistake," he told her. "My son is a kind person, but kindness doesn't build futures. He's stuck in a fantasy, playing with watches while life passes him by. You'll wake up in 5 years drowning in debt and resentment." Rhea had listened without interrupting, her face carefully neutral. "Are you finished?" she'd asked. "I'm trying to help you," my father insisted. "Someone should tell you the truth before you waste your best years." She'd thanked him politely, gotten in her car, and driven away. But she didn't tell me about the conversation, not then. She carried it alone, letting the words settle into something sharp and motivating. Later, she'd explain that my father's cruelty hadn't discouraged her. Instead, it had crystallized something she'd been thinking about for weeks. If Vikram Kumar represented the world's judgment, the conventional wisdom that said I was insufficient, then she'd prove that world wrong. Not with arguments or defenses, but with something undeniable. She started planning the very next morning. I proposed to Rhea on a quiet Sunday morning in November, in the tiny park near my shop where elderly men played chess and children fed pigeons. Nothing fancy, just me and her and the question I'd been carrying for weeks. She cried when I asked, which terrified me until she gasped out, "Yes," through the tears, laughing at my panic. We held each other while the city moved around us, oblivious. That night, I called my parents to share the news. My mother was thrilled, already planning ceremonies and guest lists. My father offered congratulations that sounded like condolences. "Marriage is expensive," he warned. "I hope you've thought about how you'll support a family on watch repairs." I assured him we had plans, though I wasn't entirely sure what those plans were. Rhea seemed confident about our financial future in a way I didn't fully understand. She'd mentioned projects she was developing, networking opportunities she was exploring, but nothing concrete enough to explain her certainty. "Trust me," she kept saying, whenever I expressed doubt. "I'm working on something." I trusted her, even when my father's warnings echoed in the quiet moments. Even when I looked at my bank account and felt the familiar anxiety tighten my chest. Rhea believed in us with an intensity that made me want to believe too, even though nothing visible had changed yet. The engagement dinner took place at a small restaurant my mother had chosen, intimate and warm with string lights and traditional decorations. Family came, friends, people I'd known my whole life. But one chair remained conspicuously empty. "Your father sends his apologies," my mother explained, her smile strained. "Something urgent came up at the last minute." We all knew it was a lie. There was no emergency, just Vikram Kumar's pointed absence, his way of expressing disapproval without confrontation. I tried to hide my disappointment, but Rhea squeezed my hand under the table, understanding exactly what that empty chair meant. Later, she'd tell me that his absence had been the final confirmation she needed. She'd been building something quietly, carefully, but my father's rejection had removed any lingering doubt about whether she should move forward. That empty chair wasn't just an insult. It was permission. While we celebrated surrounded by people who actually loved us, Rhea was already mentally finalizing details of a plan I knew nothing about. She'd been making calls, signing documents, moving money, building something substantial in the shadows. And soon, very soon, my father would have to confront exactly what he'd underestimated. 2 weeks after the engagement dinner, my father called while I was working on a particularly delicate mainspring replacement. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Still fixing other people's junk? He asked without preamble. The familiar contempt in his voice made my jaw tighten. It's called a profession, I replied evenly. It's called avoiding responsibility, he countered. Your fiancé called you ambitious the other night when your mother asked about wedding plans. Ambitious. He laughed. Do you even understand what that word means? Ambition requires growth, expansion, risk. You're doing the exact same thing you were doing 5 years ago, Nilesh. That's not ambition. That's stagnation. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that mastery took time, that there was value in perfecting a craft. But the words stuck in my throat, mixing with old shame and newer anger. She deserves better, my father continued. Someone who can actually provide, who has prospects. You're going to drag her down to your level, and one day she'll resent you for it. He hung up before I could respond. I sat in the silent shop, hands shaking, the half-repaired watch blurring in front of me. Part of me wanted to call Rhea, to be reassured. But another part wondered if my father was right, if I was being selfish, binding her to a future that looked suspiciously like stagnation. Something changed in Rhea after that. She started asking different questions during her visits, more technical, more business-oriented. How much did quality parts cost? What were the margins on repair work versus custom pieces? If someone wanted to scale watch production, what would the barriers be? I answered honestly, confused by the direction of her curiosity. Just thinking, she'd say when I asked why. But her eyes held calculations I couldn't read. She started taking notes in a small leather journal, sketching diagrams, writing down numbers. Once, I glimpsed a page covered in supplier names and price comparisons. What are you working on? I asked. She smiled mysteriously. Something important. You'll see. She started disappearing for afternoons at a time, claiming meetings with old colleagues and potential contacts. When she returned, she seemed energized, purposeful, but refused to explain the details. I need you to trust me, she said one evening, taking my hands across the workbench. Can you do that? Trust me even when you don't understand? I nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at me. She kissed my forehead. Good. Because everything I'm doing for us. Remember that. That night, after she left, I found myself staring at my grandfather's unfinished design again, wondering what she saw that I couldn't. Then Rhea disappeared completely. 2 weeks of silence. No calls, no texts, no explanation. Just gone. Panic set in around day 3. I called her phone repeatedly, getting voicemail. I messaged, getting nothing. I even went to her apartment, but her roommate said she was traveling for work and would be back soon. She's fine, the roommate assured me. Just busy. But 2 weeks felt like abandonment. My mind spiraled into dark possibilities. Maybe she'd realized my father was right. Maybe she'd met someone more suitable. Maybe the reality of binding herself to a struggling watchmaker had finally hit, and she was figuring out how to extract herself gracefully. I stopped sleeping properly, lying awake in the shop's back room, listening to clocks tick out the hours. Work became mechanical, my hands performing repairs while my mind spun worst-case scenarios. My mother called to ask about wedding planning. I made excuses. My father didn't call at all, which somehow felt worse. On day 14, I was closing the shop when I saw her through the window, standing under the streetlight, wearing professional clothes I'd never seen before and carrying a leather briefcase. Relief and anger collided in my chest. She smiled apologetically as I unlocked the door. I know, she said before I could speak. I'm sorry. But I need you to trust me just a little longer. Rhea looked different. Not just the clothes, though the sharp blazer and pressed slacks were unlike her usual casual style. It was her bearing, her confidence, the way she moved through space like someone who'd leveled up in some game I didn't know we were playing. "Where were you?" I demanded, hurt bleeding into my voice. "Working," she said simply. "On what we discussed." "We didn't discuss anything," I protested. "You just vanished." She set her briefcase on the workbench, her expression serious. "I'm going to ask you to do something difficult. I need you to trust me completely, without explanation, for just a little longer. Can you do that?" I wanted to demand answers, to understand what was happening. But something in her eyes stopped me, a certainty that felt almost magnetic. "How much longer?" I asked. "Days," she promised. "Just days. And then everything will make sense." She kissed me then, soft and reassuring, her hands gentle on my face. When she pulled back, she was smiling. "Nilesh, I need you to hear this. You are not what your father thinks you are. You're brilliant and talented and capable of things you can't even imagine yet. I see it, even if you don't." "What things?" I whispered. She just smiled. "Trust me." Then she left, leaving me alone with questions and that leather briefcase, which she deliberately left behind, knowing I'd be too respectful to open it without permission. 3 days later, an older woman entered my shop, dressed in clothes that whispered expensive rather than shouted it. She carried herself with the easy authority of someone accustomed to doors opening automatically. "Are you Nilesh Kumar?" she asked, her accent suggesting education abroad. When I confirmed, she smiled. "Excellent. I'm looking for someone who can source and install a specific vintage movement. A Peugeot 260, if you're familiar." I was. They were Swiss movements from the 1960s, elegant and reliable but increasingly rare. "I might be able to locate one," I said carefully. "What's the application?" She described a restoration project, then casually pivoted to business questions that felt like a test. Had I ever considered contract work for larger operations? What were my opinions on scaling artisan production? How did I feel about design collaboration versus solo work? I answered honestly, confused by the direction of the conversation. She seemed satisfied, purchasing a small repair service she clearly didn't need, and left her card. "In case you ever want to discuss opportunities," she said. The name on the card read, Kamala Kapoor, Senior Acquisitions. No company listed, just a phone number. That evening, I mentioned the strange interaction to Rhea. She smiled in a way I couldn't interpret. "Interesting," was all she said. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," I replied. Her smile widened. "Perfect." The next night, Rhea arrived at the shop after closing, carrying a small case I'd never seen before. She set it on the workbench between us with ceremony. "Open it," she said softly. Inside, nestled in custom foam, was a watch. But not just any watch. It was my grandfather's design, the unfinished masterpiece, except now it was real, complete, functioning. The case was polished steel, the dial hand-painted enamel, the complications visible through a sapphire crystal back. I lifted it with shaking hands. The weight was perfect, the finishing immaculate. Every detail my grandfather had sketched was here, realized with a level of craftsmanship that made my throat tight. "How?" I managed. "I found the drawings in your shop months ago," Rhea explained. "I took photographs, sent them to manufacturers, worked with specialists. It took weeks to source the right artisans, but this is the prototype. The first of what could be many. This cost thousands," I whispered, my mind calculating materials and labor. "Where did you get this kind of money?" She touched my face gently. "I'll explain everything soon. But first, I need you to understand something. This isn't just a watch. It's proof. Proof that your grandfather's vision was brilliant. Proof that you inherited his genius. And proof that the right investment in the right person can create something extraordinary." I couldn't stop asking the question. Over and over, like a broken record. How did you pay for this? Rhea sat across from me in the shop's back room, patient but firm. I have some money saved, she said. From my previous work, from investments. It's mine to use as I see fit. But why? I pressed. Why spend it on this? On me? She leaned forward, her eyes intense. Because betting on you is the safest investment I could possibly make. Because I've watched you work, seen how you think, listened to your ideas. Because your father and everyone like him measure value in all the wrong ways. She picked up the watch, holding it between us. This is your grandfather's legacy and your future, combined. When you look at this, what do you see? Impossibility, I admitted. Something I could never afford to create. Wrong, she said firmly. You see exactly what I see. A beginning. The first step toward something that matters. She stood, pacing the small space. Sometimes believing in someone means betting on them before they believe in themselves. That's what I'm doing. I'm betting on Nilesh Kumar, the most talented watchmaker I've ever met, who just happens to be too humble to see his own potential. I wanted to argue, to explain all the reasons this wouldn't work. But she stopped me with a kiss. Let me believe in you, she whispered. Please. My father showed up unannounced 2 weeks later, requesting a meeting with Rhea. Same cafe where this story began, neutral ground for a conversation she'd been expecting. She went alone, despite my offer to join. This is between me and him, she said. Trust me. They sat across from each other, coffee cooling between them while my father delivered his rehearsed speech. I understand weddings create emotional momentum, he began. But there's still time to make rational decisions. You're an intelligent woman. Surely you've realized by now that my son's situation isn't going to improve. His situation, Rhea repeated flatly. You mean his passion? His skill? His integrity? I mean his income, my father clarified. His prospects. His ability to provide the kind of life someone like you should expect. He's 30 years old, playing with watches in a building that should have been condemned years ago. That's not a foundation for marriage. That's a charity case. Rhea let him finish, her expression unreadable. When silence finally settled, she reached into her bag. Before I respond, she said calmly, I think you should see something. She placed an envelope on the table between them, thick with documents. My father stared at it, then at her. What is this? Open it, Rhea said. Then we'll talk. He did, pulling out papers that made his face go progressively paler with each page. The contract was real. Notarized, stamped, signed by multiple parties. It established Narration Works as a registered company, with Nilesh Kumar listed as co-founder and chief designer, holding 49% equity. The attached documents detailed a licensing agreement with a luxury goods distributor, a $2 million partnership for an exclusive collection based on my grandfather's designs. My father read through the pages twice, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been shock. This is impossible, he finally said. Where did this money come from? Who are these people? They're investors, Rhea explained calmly. People who recognize talent when they see it. People who understand that skill and vision matter more than your definition of respectability. She leaned forward. Your son is extraordinary at what he does. He sees mechanical systems the way musicians hear notes, finding elegance in complexity. His grandfather left behind designs that any serious collector would treasure. I simply connected those two truths with people who had resources. You're a supply chain consultant, my father protested weakly. How could you possibly arrange something like this? She smiled. I'm resourceful. And I believe in your son more than you ever have. My father stared at the contract like it might disappear. This changes nothing about his character, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. You're right, Rhea agreed. His character was always exceptional. You just couldn't see it. My father looked like someone had pulled the ground out from beneath him. All the certainty, the condescension, the airtight judgments about my insufficient life, suddenly confronted with paper proof that maybe he'd been wrong. I don't understand, he kept repeating, shuffling through the documents. How long has this been planned? Months, Rhea admitted. Since shortly after I met Nilesh. I saw what he could do, what he could become with proper resources. So I started building the infrastructure to support that future. With what money? He demanded, grasping for some flaw in the story. Your consultant's salary couldn't possibly cover this kind of investment. My grandmother left me money when she died, Rhea said quietly. Enough to either waste on safe, boring choices, or invest in something that mattered. I chose the latter. She stood, preparing to leave. You told me your son was financially useless. That he dragged me down. But the truth is simpler than you wanted to admit. Nilesh has skill you never valued because it didn't fit your narrow definition of success. He has vision you never saw because you were too busy being disappointed. She picked up the contract. This is happening, with or without your approval. But I thought you deserved to know that your assessment of your son was fundamentally wrong. He's not a failure. He never was. He was just waiting for someone to believe in him. Then she walked out, leaving my father sitting alone with his coffee and his shattered certainty. Rhea came to the shop that evening, her expression unreadable. I'd been anxious all day, wondering how the meeting with my father had gone. He saw the contract, she said, setting her bag down. And? She pulled me close. And now I can tell you everything. We sat in the back room while she explained the whole elaborate plan. How she'd inherited money from her grandmother's estate, money she'd been saving for something meaningful. How she'd spent months researching luxury watch markets, identifying gaps and opportunities. How she'd taken my grandfather's designs to manufacturers and collectors, gauging interest. That older woman who came to the shop, I said, realization dawning. Kamala Kapoor. My grandmother's friend, Rhea confirmed. Also a silent investor in luxury goods. She wanted to meet you herself, to confirm you were as talented as I'd claimed. But there was more. Rhea had done something I never suspected. Years ago, when I was struggling with parts suppliers, a small company had started giving me preferential pricing, reliable service, insider access. I'd thought it was my grandfather's old connections. That was you? I whispered. She nodded. I bought into that company 2 years ago, became a silent partner. I wanted to make sure you had access to quality materials, that your work wasn't limited by budget. I couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the scope of her belief in me. The man who trained me, Rajan Mehta, appeared at my shop the next morning, his weathered face split by a knowing smile. I suppose Rhea finally told you, he said. I nodded, still processing. You knew the whole time. She approached me 3 years ago, Rajan explained, settling onto a stool. Said she'd met a young watchmaker with extraordinary potential who didn't see it in himself. Asked if I'd be willing to mentor you more actively if she helped keep my business solvent. 3 years ago, I repeated. We weren't even together then. She didn't need romance to recognize talent, he said gently. She saw something in your work, in how you approached problems. She believed you could be great, so she started building the infrastructure that would let you become great. He pulled out a folder, old correspondence between him and Rhea, discussing my progress, my potential, my blind spots. She never interfered directly, Rajan said. Never told me what to teach you or how to guide you. She just made sure the path was clear, that resources were available, that opportunities appeared when you were ready for them. Tears burned my eyes. Why would she do all this? Because some people recognize value that others miss, Rajan said. And because she loves you, you fool. Not despite who you are, but because of exactly who you are. He stood, patting my shoulder. Now stop crying and start building. You've got work to do. I went to my father's house the next evening, uninvited but determined. He answered the door with obvious reluctance, his face carefully neutral. Nilesh. I won't stay long, I said. I just wanted to give you something. I handed him a brochure, professionally printed, showing the first Narai collection. 6 watch designs, each based on my grandfather's aesthetic but pushed forward with modern materials and movements. The photography was stunning, the descriptions elegant. My father flipped through it slowly, and I couldn't read his expression. These are impressive, he finally admitted, the words seeming to cost him something. Thank you, I said quietly. But I didn't come here for your approval. I came to say something I should have said years ago. He looked up, waiting. You were right about one thing, I continued. I don't fit your world. I never will. I don't measure success the way you do, don't want the things you want, don't value the markers of achievement you've spent your life chasing. I paused, choosing words carefully. But you were wrong about everything else. Wrong about my potential. Wrong about my worth. Wrong about what I could build if someone actually believed in me. I turned to leave, then stopped. I built my own world, Dad. And it's better than yours. His face did something complicated, but I didn't wait to interpret it. I'd said what I came to say. The launch happened on a humid Saturday in March, in a gallery space Rhea had rented in Colaba. The room filled with collectors, journalists, enthusiasts, people who understood and valued what we'd created. The watches lined glass cases, each one a small mechanical miracle, my grandfather's vision finally realized. I stood beside Rhea, wearing the first suit I'd ever owned that actually fit, watching strangers examine our work with genuine interest. Several pieces sold in the first hour. By evening's end, we were completely sold out, with waiting lists forming for the next collection. My mother came, crying with pride, hugging me so tightly I could barely breathe. My father didn't come, but I'd stopped expecting him to. Rhea found me at one point, in a quiet corner, overwhelmed by everything. You okay? She asked. I pulled her close. I still can't believe this is real. That you did all this. We did this, she corrected. I just built the platform. You created the art. As we stood there, watching people appreciate my grandfather's legacy brought to life, I finally understood what she'd been trying to tell me all along. Belief isn't just emotional support. Belief is action. It's resources, time, strategic thinking, sacrifice. She hadn't just told me I was capable. She'd proven it by building the infrastructure that let me become what she always knew I could be. I love you, I whispered. She smiled. I know. Now let's go celebrate. 6 months after the launch, we used part of the profits to establish something I'd been thinking about since everything changed. The Kumar Foundation for Overlooked Innovators. Small grants for craftspeople, designers, inventors who had skill but no platform, talent but no resources. People like I'd been, waiting for someone to believe in them. We announced it at our wedding, asking guests to contribute instead of giving traditional gifts. The response overwhelmed us. My father came to the wedding. We didn't speak much, but I saw him examining the foundation materials, reading about our mission. As he left, he stopped briefly. I was wrong, he said quietly. About many things. It wasn't an apology, not really. But it was acknowledgement, and that was enough. Later, as Rhea and I danced under string lights in the same restaurant where she'd once sat through my father's cruelty, I thought about how dramatically life could shift when the right person believed in you. Not the person you expected, not the one you thought you needed approval from. Just someone who saw clearly who you actually were and decided that person was worth investing in. What are you thinking? Rhea asked. I pulled her closer. That kindness is never wasted. That belief is the most powerful currency there is. And that I'm the luckiest person alive. She laughed, resting her head against my chest. No, she said. We're lucky. Both of us. And as we swayed together, surrounded by people who actually mattered, I finally believed her.